Archaeodeath, Death and Memory, Past and Present, with Professor Howard Williams.
What happened was I was scrolling along the good old For You page, as I do, and I came across your video. Now, this is after I had watched, obviously, Lance is a follower of mine, so I follow all of
Right.
his content. And I had seen, a lot of what you were talking about, where it's fact checking Indigenous creators on things like that, and tone policing. It kind of
Yeah.
falls down the line of tone policing a bit, and
Yeah.
it wasn't something I was going to weigh in on because I had just recently weighed in on another one, which I talked to you about. It didn't end so good for me. So when I
Yeah.
saw your video first come up, I was like, oh God, here we go again. And then it was about 10 seconds into it. I was like, so now this is a take I've not heard before. And I like hearing it, the start of it going, I am blah, 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 blah. This is
Yeah.
why I can say something. And now I'm going to say it. So
Yeah.
for everybody in here who hasn't seen the video, I do suggest you go and follow the fine professor over here and watch it because it is amazing. So I guess
Thank you.
to start this out, could you go ahead and introduce yourself to the everybody?
Yeah. Hello. Well, okay. Well, I'm a as I did in that video. It was a bit pompous, and sorry about that. And that annoyed is really interesting how it annoyed people that I introduced myself because I don't usually do that, but I did because I knew the topic would attract interest. But yeah, I'm a professor of archaeology, so I teach at a university, the University of Chester. As I teach, I research. And then all the admin that every university academic has to do. But I'm a teacher and a researcher. So I've been doing field work and library-based or desk-based research for post PhD 23 years, early medieval archaeology, burial archaeology, and one of the subsets of that is Viking studies. And I do mainly archaeology, but I have obviously at least a working knowledge for teaching purposes, and I go to conferences with specialists in linguistics and literature and specialists in the history of the Viking Age. So while I'm not a historian and I'm not a specialist in the language and literature, I do have some knowledge of those areas, but I mainly focus on the archaeology. Yeah, so that's me, and I've been doing TikToking since May 2020, just pushing out a video a day or two, just on various aspects. I haven't gone down a completely educational route with it. I've done site visits and just talking about issues. I haven't done a I'm going to tell you about this, type approach,
Yeah.
that educatory. I've kept it a bit looser than that, but I've tried to just build a presence here. Hello, everyone.
I enjoy your content. So, like I said, I was scrolling across that day, I came across that one, and instant follow, absolutely instant follow. And I immediately then sent that video to everybody that I know because I am so sick of seeing the very uneducated problematic. We'll get into why they're problematic here shortly.
Yeah,
Hot takes on things like the Viking era specifically.
yeah.
There's a
Oh yeah,
lot of historical reasons why it starts to get a bit problematic when you start to, Viking era up here, it takes on that
yeah.
Aryan sort of mentality.
Oh yeah,
Um,
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. It's a constant problem, and yeah.
yeah, and it's a long problem.
So yeah, well, I mean that's one of the things, right? Because it's, I mean, let's put it this way: whatever I say in terms of my research that hits a public venue, people immediately want to box you in one place or another, categorize you as coming out against or for some modern identity politics. And I have been on the receiving end of on issues to do with Viking women. I have made my views clear on certain archaeological finds and how we've got to be very cautious about how we interpret them, such as the famous BJ 581 chamber grave that was excavated in the late 1870s, but had the recent DNA evidence showing that it was a weapon burial of a female,
Yeah,
sexed female. And I was one of the naysayers on that research that actually said, whoa, 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 whoa. Um, you know, it's not so simple. And the reason I did that, and I came out publicly on that story in a very negative way against that research, and some of my academic colleagues will never forgive me for doing that, was because I saw there was a bigger danger because of while it may look like a very empowering story for women, yeah, kick-ass warrior women. I've seen the TV show Vikings. Lagathas are real. We've got the real evidence, and that looks like a nice. And everyone was loved this that side of the story. But of course, the danger is what you're doing is you're finding simply. I'm not saying everyone did this. I'm saying the danger is that this can be consumed as basically a female version of the existing stereotype of the the Norse society, that they were freedom loving, egalitarian. Women were always in a position of power. And while that's very useful and liberating, and I'm not saying it didn't happen at all, I was making a point that, whoa, this evidence doesn't
It's not
take us
across
there
the
yet,
board.
you know.
That's the
Yeah,
situation. Like people will look at that, especially without any background in it, and
yeah,
it loses all nuance. So then it's across the
yeah, yeah,
board. All women were
yeah, yeah,
just, even within Norse society, each different community was different. Like that's the thing when people look at like Norse society specifically, and they hold it up to other ancient sort of civilizations, it's
yeah,
not across the board, because it was like a chieftain run situation, so
yeah.
individually, and then within
Yeah.
individual households. So like
I just, what I was scared of is by people taking on this news in 2017 about Viking warrior women now being proven, that they might miss the point that this was a very unequal society, a very, very repressive society in many ways, and by celebrating this idea of a freedom northern democratic society, it actually does negative damage to perceptions of Southern European and Western European societies that women had a lot of freedom in those societies too. And there's a very sort of romanticized vision that I was trying to make sure people were aware that this is a bit more dangerous and a bit more that supremacist northern
that's where I was going to go with that.
Scandinavian. Yeah,
A
yeah.
lot.
So that's the danger of whenever you go, sort of go on record with a view on a new piece of research, you've got to constantly go, hang on, this might be viewed this way, this might be viewed by these people over here this way. And so, I'm just using that as an example where actually a lot of my colleagues thought, Howard, why are you coming out against this story and nitpicking and fact checking that story? In that case, I was, because, so I find myself on different sides of arguments, both with members of the public and with my academic colleagues, because we're constantly aware of how these stories are consumed in sometimes very dangerous ways by the public, without nuance and without and so yeah, I kind of find myself, sometimes I shut up. Obviously I don't comment on everything. I'm not like one of these, for those in the UK will know, these backbench MPs that come out they're in front of the media about every news, every story. I'm not like that. I keep quiet about most things, but sometimes I think you have to, as an academic, make your voice clear, I feel. And sometimes, especially when you see, I saw video after video of, I'm afraid I think you'll find the Vikings were colonizers. Let me show you a map from Wikipedia and let me tell you 3 facts. And you just go, okay, yes. Yeah. But it's just like, this is the problem I have, is that, if you do that kind of thing, it can help people to learn and to correct people, but it can also be incredibly patronizing, and when a lot of information is out there already. So, and also it can feed into enabling, again, those very extremist views. Yeah, we've got one over on this character because he doesn't know everything that, I've and it's so I suppose my point is, whatever.
Also borders very hard on classist sometimes, and like a lot of that needs to be checked. So my issue specifically with the Viking women narrative, and I'm in agreement with you. So the thing about humans as a species is, at any given point, we know the most we're going to know. We seem to think that's it. So there's not a lot of questioning where it should be. And I feel like it does a disservice to the history as well. And when we're talking about like modern feminism, because we're going to talk about the parallels between these historical events and then where it sits now. So as a woman nowadays, when we're talking about modern feminism and stuff like that, if you're going to take something that was actually quite oppressive and not across the board, not a monolith, and hold that up as a standard, I think we're doing a disservice to ourselves and to women of the time. And the other problematic issue with that specific female Viking narrative is that was actually first brought around by a specific group of Germans, and it was used predominantly to try to promote females within their society that they were planning on creating. So when you're perpetuating this myth, my little Jewish self gets a little bit uncomfortable because it's not factual. Like, there were Viking warriors, absolutely, that were women. There were women in Anglo-Saxon societies who were women. That, like, warriors who were women. That doesn't mean that was society-wise. You know what I mean? Like, Joan of Arc was not all of France. This is my point.
I think, can I make another point that I think will perhaps disturb and also interest your viewers, is that you've got to remember, as an academic community of scholars, we're in the 2020s now. We're only 2 generations away from scholars who were studying the Vikings during that particular era of German,
Mm-hmm.
Scandinavian, North American, and the scholarship communities that have grown up in academic universities since the 1950s have worked their ass off to distance themselves from that view. Even those scholars in particular Western European countries that were, invaded or were actually participatory in those regimes, they've had to work very hard. Even the same characters that went through a vetting and had academic careers that lasted into the 70s and 80s, who had been academics under that regime.
Mm-hmm.
They've had to work hard, and we've seen in Viking studies and early medieval studies more broadly, a lot of attempts to internationalize, to not simply make it about American academics, not simply make it about British academics, to make sure that Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic, Finnish, Polish scholars are part of the conversation. And yet, if I dare to say, I see increasingly a kind of North American hegemony over these debates, which can be quite unhelpful when I'm working. I literally am in communication with Polish scholars, French scholars, and when you enter into a discussion, it has to be framed in a North American way. And this can be. I'm not saying North American perspectives aren't welcome. There's some great scholars, there's some great voices, but it can get very much like you're in a lecture theatre in Bristol or in Hamburg or in Warsaw or something, but really you've got to make sure your agenda reaches the approval of someone who's in New York or and therefore when you're dealing with a topic as sensitive as this, where it may be 1,000 years ago, but this is still pertinent to how Europe and the world understands.
And I feel if we can learn
its origins
anything from history, if we can learn anything, it is the importance of not weaponizing history in any capacity. So even now when we're talking like modern feminism and stuff, you are weaponizing history in an inaccurate way in order to present a fallacy to support your narrative. It doesn't matter which side of the road that narrative's on. We have seen that in the past, and it's never turned out well. And I have some questions and comments in here about holistic history and male bias in history. So I'm going to make a recommendation to everybody in here. There is a documentary. It's also a book. It's called The Ascent of Woman. It's astronomical from a feministic standpoint. And basically what it does is it does a holistic view of the entire world, humanity's history, without removing women from the narrative. So it tells it side by side as it should be told, which unfortunately most of the history books aren't written. And there's some really, really good stories in there that are not fallacies made to kind of fit any sort of narrative. Is very educational. It's very well done, and it's not, anti-men or too pro-woman. It's just history, how it should have been presented. And there's something, it kills me because it used to be on everything. They had it up for about 6 months, and now you have to hunt for it. And I'm like, of course you do. But I can watch Ancient Aliens any time of day.
I know.
So riddle me this nonsense.
Well, I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? Is that we've got so many different kinds of what we call, as a general term, pseudo-archaeology. And my North American colleagues are very exercised and very get angry about ancient aliens with good reason. And I likewise share their frustrations because it's everywhere. It's like music in a lift. You can't escape it. But I qualify it by saying that actually there are many other brands of pseudo-archaeology competing, and while people rightly say Ancient Aliens is explicitly fundamentally based on racist tropes
it's so
about
fucking racist.
But that's only one kind of racist archaeology, and one could say that an uncritical characterization of Norse women as freedom, empowered, constantly swinging axes into people's faces and breastfeeding children at the same time, kind of sort of is almost explicit. You can't get any more directly from that Teutonic Aryan ideal of womanhood. And so when some of my colleagues just uncritically go into the news cycles of they've got this exciting new evidence, it shows us what women did, I'm just going how's this going to be consumed? And that's the challenge we face.
Amita, I think that's how I say your name. It is not predominantly focused on European history, which is a deviation from what we usually see in these sorts of documentaries and works. It is very much global. It's human history from the start of human history. It's the story of civilization, basically, and society, but without ejecting women from it. So you'll learn a lot of very interesting things, and I highly recommend.
Oh, yeah.
And one more comment. Christopher Columbus did not discover North America. He was discovered lost at sea. That's the narrative we are now using. Moving on. But yes, the Vikings were absolutely at Turtle Island long before he was found lost at sea. And that is an interesting story that we will get into later.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have some questions for the good professor. And I think we'll start these over here. So I want to ask you first, and this was your second question you sent. When that video and those videos first came across about the fact checking Lance specifically, but why is it that you felt the need to weigh in, and why did you weigh in the way that you did? Like, what was the driving force there?
Yeah. I don't know, because I can't shut up. Maybe I should shut up. But I thought particularly, I saw that video and I thought, look, I have something to say here. And I thought, I was a bit angry. I was having a bad morning and I thought I felt a bit angry. And I did sort of an angry TikTok. It didn't seem angry to anyone else, but actually that was me being angry and trying to, and I did it because I thought I'm getting sick of this fact check. It's not that we shouldn't counter misinformation. And it's about, we shouldn't counter misinformation that sets up and enables that white supremacist narrative of Vikings were colonists, Vikings were adventurers, Vikings stretched their trade routes and proudly sort of beard wafting in the breeze from the prow of a longship. Come on. And if you're going to, particularly the context of indigenous creators, and this is something that obviously I've been working with over 30 years of my career, working with or talking with archaeologists across the world, and it affects my work on funerary remains, it affects my work on the early Middle Ages. I just thought, this is not the right way. And I thought I aimed that video at creators of history and archaeology content. I wasn't trying to chastise the general public. I was trying to make a point that really, is this the way we're going to approach our behaviors on this app? Is simply every time someone says something slightly wrong, it's actually, I think you can find,
Well,
and I thought,
arguably, if professors of this shouldn't be doing that, then lay people with absolutely no history education in it whatsoever, absolutely can just take all the seats,
But I've got to say, and add to that, is that doesn't mean people are saying, oh, you're giving Lance a free pass. No, I'm not. I mean, I thought it would go the other way. I expected a lot of people. I had a few angry comments at me for daring to talk about the Lance, but I expected a lot more sort of anger that I was daring to say he was wrong on some points. But I don't think that's, I happen to
liked it.
Oh, well, I think his agenda, from what I understand of it, and I don't want to speak for him, but I get a sense is he doesn't care about whether he gets every point right. He's got a bigger story he's trying to talk about that's slightly more important than what happened in the 9th century AD. Okay. Yeah. But what I think that people who see this as marking one up against a person who doesn't know what they're talking about is not the narrative. And so I thought I needed to put something out there so that people are trying to latch onto that wasn't yet another, I think you'll find, approach. And I think academics have a bad rep. We're constant. The pseudo archaeologists out there will mock us all the time. Oh, you're just trying to stamp on a gatekeeping. You've got all these secret finds. You've got all these secret that tell us the world's truths, but you're keeping it from us. The government have paid you off. I'd love if there's any government officials watching this to see what I'm doing. Just give me bribes. I want bribes. I want to be corrupt. But no one's bribing me or anything.
My paycheck's going to show up. Like, is it coming in the mail? Do I have to sign for it? That would be wonderful.
Exactly. So my point is, I'm not trying to hide things. I don't want to be just constantly shouting at the internet about how everyone's wrong. I want to be constructively engaging. And I thought, however it went, I knew that I had to say something. And that's what I did.
I think the way that you approach it, because this is the thing, is shutting people down like that in any capacity really shuts down their desire to learn anymore. The way you do it kind of leaves it open for people to ask questions and have a respectful discussion instead of, you're wrong, this is why you're wrong, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's the fastest way to have people go, no, I'm not interested. And I think that just causes a division that is clearly unnecessary. That this is discussing an existing division as we have now. I don't think we need to widen it any further, because even me, so there was a few comments that had come up about Vikings in North America specifically and their relations with Indigenous people. And so we have the two sagas that the story of Vinland comes from, and everybody is familiar with those. We also have oral history. So Indigenous people in North America, 100%, it's oral history. So there's not written history. There's none of that. But for some reason, and I don't know if it's racism or maybe it's racism, but it could also be racism. People tend to not take oral histories as a history, but they'll take a stone tablet carved by somebody, which is funny because actually when you look at Norse culture, what was it? It was a stick. I think they found a stick and it had runes inscribed in it. And they were like, oh, this must be some big thing. And it was basically a penis joke. They had just inscribed a penis joke. I'm like, people are people, and they've been people for 1,000 years. So in the oral histories, we also have from the Indigenous side what had happened. And it was not rainbow sunshine and a nice meal. It was a very difficult situation that obviously didn't work out because the Norsemen left. We saw them leave very quickly, and that is not historically what they would do when they built a settlement. You know what I mean? But at the same time, I didn't weigh into that too much, because the other point you brought up is the importance nowadays. So in modern times, we've talked about how some of the more Aryan thought processes have overtaken a lot of Norse culture. And I see it in my Norse pagan followers as well. A lot of stuff has been appropriated. They're in there actively battling to fight that on a daily basis. And so now in North America, when we see this camaraderie happening between these two groups, I think the message that's coming out from that is more important than the history. So we're seeing a statistically white group of people and Indigenous people coming together in a form of brotherhood over something. And is it really at that point, do we really want to be going, well, actually, though, you hated each other. And actually, though, that, you know?
Yeah, well, so, that was really the bigger narrative that Lance was addressing, and I felt was very important, because I will tell you, I have been not writing and researching myself, but watching these developments, and I have seen a lot of academics literally equate anyone who has an interest in anyone who's not an academic or an academic that has an interest in the Vikings as you must be that way inclined, in the same fashion as my research on early medieval Britain, Anglo-Saxon England, early medieval Wales. I must have a closet full of memorabilia of a certain regime if I have an interest in the early Middle Ages. And I would say that the problem with that very simplistic take is actually it's a really rich and complex time of the human past, which set up so many strands of European interaction with the world. And if we go around deriding anyone that shows an enthusiasm, whether it's because they like to wave a sword around, whether it's because they have a spiritual connection, because they see parallels between various indigenous beliefs, as I see a gentleman here was mentioning, and Norse spirituality. Who am I? And see, this is the problem that academics forget. They think because we studied it and we set up a lot of the narratives from the 19th century, that the problems, we are the problem. We created this problem. We think we can gatekeep it. We think we can own it. And we think it's ours to control. So if I don't like the TV show Vikings, I can somehow do something about it. If I don't like the fact that someone on the internet says, I kind of like the fact that I have a lot of respect for Norse pagan culture, I've got to be immediately shouting them down and calling them so I think I see academics struggle with this, and I see them actually creating more barriers to engagement through that attitude. They're actually putting off a lot of people, as you say. And when I see someone like Lance actually saying, regardless of the detail of the historical accuracy, he's saying, I see parallels here. I see a brotherhood or a sisterhood or a connection, a parallel, or whatever you want to call it. And he can use his own words. I see something that could be very different. In fact, I would have thought something very different would be said by Indigenous native creators. And I think that was really positive and something that needs to be taken forward. And literally 2 years ago, I saw an article written by an academic in the States claiming that basically anyone that shows, or basically implying anyone that shows an interest in contemporary Norse paganism must be somehow, they are implicated. They are somehow as good as a stormtrooper. And I thought, if you say this kind of thing, you're not only just shutting up. What next? You've watched a Marvel film, so that makes you a supremacist too, does it? No, it doesn't. These are ways in. these are really important ways. They can be fantasy. They can be completely detached from historical reality. They can link to myths. No, I suppose my point is that I'm trying to balance between, yes, we do need to counter misinformation and dangerous narratives, but also we shouldn't, our gut reaction, our default shouldn't be to assume that anyone that has an interest in our academic discipline must be dodgy, must have an ulterior motive, they may have misinformed ideas, they may have deeply problematic ideas, but we're not going to get across to a lot of people. And if all we do is shout digitally or in the real world at anyone that shows a passion, an interest, and frankly, yeah, I think this is really the wrong way to go. So that means that sometimes, because I say things like that, I have colleagues saying to me, "Oh, you're just an apologist. You're an apologist for extremists." And I go, "No, I'm not. I have a very clear line on what I will and will not tolerate. But that doesn't mean I'm going to shout at everybody all the time on Twitter or on, in the media,
Well, and I
just
think
because they don't have a full understanding." Yeah.
For lay people that aren't studied in this, that have an interest in it, like you say, and may have problematic views, so many of them don't even know why their views are problematic or where those problematic views come from. So if you're immediately shutting these people down, how are you fixing that narrative? What are you actively doing to correct the history and these things that have happened in the past to stop it from continuing? If you shut these people down, they're not going to hear you anymore.
And the same with academics too. I mean, I had a conference 3 years ago in Leicester, in the Midland city of England, in the UK, at Leicester, and it was about colonialism and the Vikings. The conference was actually on about decolonization and how new perspectives. But of course, we were in Leicester on a day conference with a limited budget, and of course, we couldn't have representation from Indigenous North American. We couldn't have Indigenous Scandinavian, Sami, representation, Indigenous elsewhere. We couldn't have those kind of representations, and people via social media jumped on the conference literally after it ended, said, "What a waste of time! You didn't include those voices." I thought, well, there was a practical and a financial.
If they can't be there, you can't have it. Like I'll never
Yeah.
understand that. It's so divisive that you need to have their voices, but don't speak for them. So if they can't be there, don't speak at all.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Is it wasn't. Yes, of course, we could have had an event that had a massive budget. We would have been bad of us not to have included. And there's a lot of sexism and casual exclusion in academia. I wouldn't deny that, but I think my point is you've got to pitch your battles and say, well, when is this worth having criticizing an event or a publication or a narrative, and when is it actually an opportunity for a conversation? When is this actually, rather than fact checking and denouncing, is this an opportunity to have a chat? Whether it's Lance or it's somebody, a small creator. I think a lot of the time we academics, I'm talking about here, miss real open, golden opportunities for a frank, difficult but honest conversation about issues, because we're too busy posturing about what other people get wrong. And I feel that has got to stop. And some of those that are the most avidly characterize themselves as activists, some of them are perhaps need to learn that lesson too, is that they're not necessarily opening doors to a broader, inclusive scholars, students, and audiences if all we do is shout about why everyone's wrong. So you know what? Yeah. Those people that watch Ancient Aliens, I bet some of them are laughing at it as they watch, in the same way that perhaps people watch the Real Housewives of whatever. That doesn't mean they necessarily everyone buys into that lifestyle. They're watching, going, "Look at these jokers." A lot of people watch stuff because it's there. A lot of people watch stuff and they're happy to be. They'll be open to different views. Maybe they don't believe in Ancient Aliens, and maybe they do believe in Ancient Aliens. Even if you do, that doesn't mean you are yourself a racist. It just means that you're buying into a trope that's dangerous. But that doesn't mean that person is like there's nothing that they can't be salvaged. They're damaged goods. We can't bother talking to those individuals. Of course, there's potential so much, and it is just entertainment, as the moderator rightly says. It's an entertainment show, and it's horse manure, but it gets people interested in the past. And there's so many ways we can then capture that and translate that into real engagement. And I think we sometimes miss those opportunities. That's my point. So I try to be. Some people call me wishy-washy. I see myself as trying to be not a shouting, angry academic guarded from an ivory tower. I try to just be a little bit open.
As a historian, like that wishy-washy is such a terrible. That is your job. You need to be somewhere in the middle where you have ideas and you have your own beliefs, but then you're also open to different things that you're seeing. And it could be this or it could be interpreted that way. I don't like seeing anybody, especially in the history world, be like, this is what it is, and this is how it is, and that's how it's going. And I'm like, you're not doing your job. You're not doing your job if you're not capable of intaking information and forming new bias and working towards it.
Well, I must say that some of my fellow archaeology and history creators on this app are better communicators than I am by far. They're half my age, double my confidence, and they're very emphatic. And I love that in one level, but another level, I think it has its problems.
Yeah.
Very emphatic, no, it's not like that. This is the way it is. That shouty at camera thing. And I don't want to go down that route.
Yeah, exactly. Scientific method. Okay, but people like to forget this is still relevant when we're talking history circles. We do not know everything. We do not know everything at any given point. We do not. There is still more to be found. Like even as the years go on and new technology is being developed, so that now we have all these different ways to excavate things, to find things we thought were just a hole, and now we find out, no, this was a big burial, blah 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 blah. We can never, I think, as humans, and that's one of the most dangerous things we do, is we assume that we know. We assume that we figured out all there is to know until some new technology comes along. And then, people have their tail between their legs 10 years later going, okay, I was wrong. I made this broad statement. I was very, very strong about it, but I was wrong. And so now, like, you had one more question that I really liked. And it's, can you explain what you mean when you say like Viking lore, Viking history has been used to further extremist behavior and colonization?
Well, yeah, I mean, the earliest antiquarians who were exploring Viking era sites were inspired by medieval written sources. They're actually dating back to the 15th, 16th century. They're exploring the physical sites in Denmark and Norway to write their national histories. And so this goes back to the Middle Ages itself, and the sagas themselves are attempts to glorify ancestors of Icelandic families in the 13th century, handed down oral histories that are then being written down. And when we get through to the 18th, 19th centuries, I mean, massively skirting over an issue, we see nation states in Europe using the Vikings as protagonists and antagonists as part of their national history. And England's a good example. So the English romantic view of Englishness is characterized, particularly from the late 19th century, as about facing off against the Vikings, accommodating the Vikings, and getting the best of both out of them. And that's what's often missed in understanding a lot of English 19th century racialized history, is that Englishness was seen as a melting pot in which the Celts, the Romans, the Saxons, and the Northmen or the Norsemen or the Vikings were all brought the best of what allows the English, and maybe will allow the Irish, Welsh, and Scots to join in, to colonize and missionize the world.
One moment. I'm not sure if you guys can hear that, but I can't hear anything right now.
Sorry.
There's an emergency happening down my street. Just give it 1 minute.
Okay.
Do continue. Sorry, I want to hear that too.
I suppose my point is that the story of the Vikings in different nation states in Europe formed part of the origin story of those nations, those individual nations, and shared senses of racial history that were being pursued. And we get here talking about on this app more through science but also through the study of archaeological sites. So when we get to the early 20th century, we already have 150 years of antiquarians feeding into these national stories in which the Vikings have an important role as progenitors, both as enemies and as friends, or as as your ancestors, or your ancestors that become, or the people who become your ancestors after conquest and colonization, or whatever term you want to use. But so Dublin is a good example. I mean, the whole of Irish nationals. Yeah, okay, we'll come back to that then. But my point would be, so it's nothing new to have this dangerous equation of Vikings with national origins, but also simultaneously with broader senses of whiteness, European superiority, and martial prowess in particular. And that's why, as a recruiting drive in Norway after the invasion, the German army, and particularly the SS, used the Viking heritage, the shared Viking heritage, as a recruitment drive for Norwegian men, saying, join up, we're all brothers together. We've literally just invaded you, Denmark and Norway, but we're your, and of course,
Yeah.
obviously most people didn't. There was a fierce resistance, but some people were happy to go down that route during the Nazi occupation. And so we see these, and in post Second World War, obviously there was a massive backlash against that story. And yet we see with various neo groups, it's always a neo, we see the emergence of this love of the Vikings, perpetuating from the 60s and 70s through the 80s, 90s, noughties, and now. And we've seen again, often it's a very confused, it doesn't have any historical depth. It's not a single vision, lots of people are able to latch onto the Vikings from Vinland itself, from ideas of that there was an early version, a pre-Columban white European presence that marked that territory as there, that legitimizes a white superior view of of Turtle Island, of that. This was never native. This was ours first. Scary though that may be, and perverse that may be. I'm not advocating that. I'm explaining a crude version of the logic. Through to the Scandinavian nations, England, we have our extremist groups now. So when we have heathenry and modern spiritual connections to these peoples, there's a connection, an overlap there. And likewise with the reenacting community, there's an overlap there. Occasionally there are people that come into those groups who have those kind of mindsets. And that's why those groups, rather than academics tend to deride those groups, those guys and girls are at the front line. They are the people on the front line against this kind of extremism coming through popular culture. So rather than, my final point, academics saying, oh gosh, I've just discovered, that Vikings are liked by some extremists, we should be going, there's communities out there, folklorists of spiritual, of Norse pagans, of reenacting, living history groups, even cosplay groups. These are the people that have to face this day in and day out in their interests, because whether it's through Lord of the Rings, role playing or cosplay, or it's all based on, there are racial modes in those communities and racial ways of thinking about a fantasy past or a real past, Assassin's Creed Valhalla or whatever it may be, gaming. We rather than sort of denouncing anyone that touches on the Vikings in those media as tainted, we should be saying these are the communities that have to deal with this BS. They're the ones that are fighting that. We can work with them and giving informed, inclusive, decolonized views of the Vikings. And that's why I think it's so important. That's why, I suppose, getting to it, why I thought I needed to sort of start speaking out on that issue when I saw Lance's video, rather than telling him what does he know about the Vikings. So actually say, yeah, this is exactly what we need. Sorry, that was a long spiel, but I am an academic, so you got to forgive me.
I think one of the other things, and I see this quite a lot as well, with the romanticization of, and I'll say Viking culture, because I can't even say Norse culture. There's a distinct difference between the two. Like Viking is a job. I think it falls under the same category as we see pirating, because it is essentially what it is. You're a pirate. And people seem to hold this in that. So we see it with, I see resurgences of this, especially in times of very like anti-establishment sort of movements, fighting back against the government, oppression, society. And I think it comes from a human desire to be freed of things. And it's that whole animalistic sort of, no, I'll take it. It's mine. I can do what I want. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. And we see that with pirates. Same, every once in a while, we'll get like these weird societal obsessions with pirating in general. And I've noticed that. And that's, I think, where you get some of the more problematic Viking groups, is they take it for that reason. The very, like, your negative stereotypes of the Vikings, and not even stereotypes, negative facts. Some of the things they did do that a lot of people, when romanticizing, will kind of look over that. Like, oh, we'll ignore that little bit, that one there, that doesn't fit. They're the groups that take that one. And they're like, oh, we like that though. And unfortunately, those sorts of groups, I have noticed, tend to be the loudest. Now, they're not the majority, but the noise they make really kind of go over the din. You know what I mean? And so I know there's a lot of people that are actively fighting against that as we speak.
Well, I don't know if this is too sensitive a topic, but one of the things I'm writing about at the moment, I will give you a hint, is that I'm doing a reflection on a book I'm doing an afterword of a new academic book on. It's going to be on Viking public history and heritage. So looking at how the Vikings are part of museums, heritage sites, communities, and how it's used and abused. And the book will include contributions talking about far-right Danish politics, for example, how the Vikings are misused in that way. And my afterword is trying to make a point about we've got to be very careful how we jump on denouncing particular groups who could be our friends. Just what I said, basically.
Yeah.
And the example I use is the 6th of January Capitol riot, where the poster boy for that riot was said by many media outlets to be wearing a Viking horned helmet.
That's not even
and
a
of course,
Viking helmet.
well, simultaneously, when I saw that's fine for news story, you expect the news media outlets to say something dumb and ignore the red face and ignore the long history of appropriation of indigenous culture and parody of indigenous culture by extremists on the right. But to see academics then doing the same, thinking it was good intentions, thinking with good intentions, oh, I've got to denounce this. It's I'm a Viking specialist. I've got to disassociate with myself. I said, well, hang on. This isn't anything about you exclusively. This is about indigenous communities that are alive and well, and you're ignoring by making this all about Viking discourse. This whatever that was happening in the troubled mind of that individual, and whenever he's got his tattoos and whenever he put his headdress on, and then the criminal acts he did and has been prosecuted for. That's the important thing, not the fact that your precious little academic area has some connection with some dodgy characters. So my point would be, obviously, specialists and academics should be engaged in this topic and be voices against extremists. That I'm not disputing. But I see again and again academics doing this and riding roughshod over indigenous communities in the process of performing their own hand wringing and expunging their guilt. And I'd rather we were a little bit more mature and actually said, yeah, we've got a problem here. We've got a serious problem with extremists, but we're not going to get anywhere by just writing a piece in The Conversation or a piece in an online news magazine and go, yeah, it's so bad. When you're actually ignoring the real world effects on people in the countries. It happened to be the United States in that instance, but it could have been another country. We've had it in Finland, we've had extremists in Norway, we have it in the UK. Using these Viking themes and stuff. Rather than just oh, that's a bit difficult. Or I as an academic, I've got to tell everyone that I really don't approve of that. Yeah, we kind of assume you don't approve of that. We kind of take that as read that you're not a screaming extremist. But what are you going to do about it? What are you actually going to do about it? And one thing you can at least not do is to ride roughshod over indigenous communities and their advocacy while we perform our own guilt. Or sorry, that's a bit of a rant, but I might do a video about that. But that's what I'm writing about, because I think it's very, very sensitive. It's a sensitive topic, but I feel I can't sit on the fence with that kind of thing. And I know they're trying to do their best, but I think it can often cause more harm than cause good by just sort of. Yeah.
See, and I think the same thing. So like you say, like you don't want to sit on the fence about it. You can't, because like I said, the minority is very loud. There's a very vocal minority. So if people that don't have these measured academic respectable sort of stances about this aren't weighing in with their own versions of, well, actually, but less passive aggressive, like just gonna stop you there, then it takes on a really dangerous weaponized sort of, it can be misinterpreted. And the problem with humans in general, any option to misinterpret something, we routinely do. We take it, we make it something, and if we can run with it, we will. So it's important. And yeah, like Bixel says, it's not a rant. You know what you're talking about, and everybody wants to hear it. So that's also.
But I find a lot of my academic colleagues won't touch any of this, and I understand why. Particularly female scholars, particularly younger scholars, they can't, because everything they say will be shouted down. So there is that gender dynamic on social media. If you happen to be a female voice, if you happen to be indigenous voice or any other minority voice, you will be shouted down. So I feel it is incumbent on me to. Both. Oh yeah, God forbid a mixture. Yes, yeah. But my point is that I can't be vocal on every issue, and but I think sometimes one has to just sort of occasionally go, no, I'm not having this.
Hold on. Yeah. So one of the other things I had coming up, and this was in the last couple of weeks, and this kind of brings me back. There's been some conversations here about indigeneity. and not speaking over Indigenous voices. And what people, and like I am the first one to be in defense of all this, but what people like to forget, Indigenous people are not just brown. They're not. There are white Indigenous people. There's the Sami, for example, is a good example. And when I saw this discourse last week that started happening, it was actually about Irish people. So the Irish people have been colonized for a solid 800 years. And you know, before England did it, the Vikings were doing it. So they have been consistently colonized. And you see that. And I find it weird because there's this new camaraderie between the Norse and Indigenous in North America, where historically speaking, that's inaccurate. But anytime there's trying to be a camaraderie between Irish people and the Indigenous in North America, somebody brings it up as like, oh, you can't say anything because you're white and you aren't oppressed. I'm like, this was an actual sisterhood. This is an actual the same. Like the system used here. I can sit back and I can look at everything that happened to the Irish people and I can draw a parallel to what happened to Indigenous people here, because it was a blueprint that England specifically tried out first on the Irish people and then took it around the globe on everybody else. You know what I mean? So I've had to weigh into a lot of discussions about that. And then you'll have the same conversations about indigeneity. And I'm like, are we forgetting the Sami people? Are we forgetting the Indigenous people of Scandinavia? Because guess what? They're white. There's not a lot of sun up there. You know what I mean? And I feel like it is just as equally important. So these people, the same with the Irish, same as the Sami, everybody else, they were just as oppressed and colonized as everybody else. The Sami people to this day are constantly begging people to stop making them elves in holiday movies, because they are. So their entire culture is appropriated as the North Pole. There's about 5 movies on Netflix right now that are beyond problematic. And it's like, we're a people, we're not elves. Please stop. We don't make your toys. You know what I mean? And so I think when you shut people down because of their skin color, it kind of takes away from this new world we're in, where people are being able to actively reconnect with their indigeneity, regardless of where in the world it is. And so that's something that I personally, on a regular basis, my fight for indigeneity is not just for Indigenous North Americans. It's not just for people with brown skin. It is for all people with Indigenous roots. And I think that's why it's so important, even when we're talking about like Norse culture and stuff, to stop the misinformation, because you're talking about a real people. You're talking about a real people that still exist to this day and are still actively trying to reclaim a lot of their culture that was taken away. Because, you know, Catholicism.
And again, it comes down to context to some degree, doesn't it? So, for example, if you're dealing with these concepts in Ireland, you've got a very different dynamic of Viking story. And I've just been reading a publication about Viking heritage in Dublin and Waterford, and how the story of the Vikings is told in museums and heritage sites. And it's a very different set of dynamics to, say, Jorvik, the heritage centre in York, or in Normandy or in Denmark. They all have to deal with different kind of national and local context, but there's not a blanket narrative, and one narrative that will work for some places won't work for other places and can be deeply dodgy if taken out of context. So there's no single template for working through how we approach the Vikings, because they mean so many different things to local regions, local areas. So, for example, just quickly as an example, the area I lived near but not in, of the Wirral Peninsula, which is a sort of strange little slab-like pieces of land sticking into the Irish Sea, has been since the early Middle Ages had Welsh speakers, Irish settlement, Viking settlement, English, Anglo-Saxon settlement. And in recent years, it's the biggest docks, the Birkenhead docks. Much of British shipping in the 19th and early 20th century was made at Birkenhead. When you have that complex story of working class history, a lot of Irish immigration, and yet they're very proud of their Vikings. They see them. There's a whole thing on the Wirral about we're Vikings. It's like a mini version of Minnesota. We're Vikings, and of course it's BS. They're not Vikings, but actually, in that kind of post-industrial working class area, incredibly rich bits, some of the richest houses of British English footballers are on the Wirral, and some of the poorest housing in northwest England is on the Wirral. That contrast of wealth. Academics have got to think very carefully. How do I enter that space? How do I enter that conversation? It's not dealing with Indigenous people in that example, but I'm just using it as example of how there's not a one size fits all, approach to talking to people about these things, because even this is only 25 miles or from where I live, and yet the stories, the narratives about the Vikings there and here where I live in North Wales, completely different. And it's that micro regional variation of what stories people want to hear. And I think that people forget that, not only just different ethnicities, indigeneities, but also different local stories, and it may be 1,000 years ago, but these stories still matter for people. They have pub names after them, and they have road names, and they've got, even on the Wirral, they've got every settlement name has the Old Norse equivalent underneath, which is kind of ridiculous at one level. And I sort of roll my eyes and I go, oh God. But another level, I'm not going to discount it and deride it, because it's something that people can make themselves distinctive locally, that they've got that Viking heritage. And yeah, Viking as a term is roll the eyes, dodgy, but if
I
it
think it
means
means
something to
something else
people,
now. Like I feel like
yeah,
because it's taken on its own whole thing now. And like you're talking about this where these place names and heritage wise and stuff, but it's bigger than that because it's global now, because there's religious and spiritual connotations to it. So it means so much. Like I had Brett here said we should have a summit about the Viking narrative. It would be impossible at this point, and it's because it is a many-headed hydra that has taken on
yeah,
so many different things to so many different people, even to children. You talk to children in school right now, and like little boys, like my son has his own idea in his head, this glorious idea of the Vikings, and it's something for everybody. And I think that's why it gets so divisive. I think the only important thing that we do have to do is make sure we're checking any of the problematic stuff that comes up. Like it's all fun and games, it's all make believe. A lot of it
yeah,
is make believe, and it's great and it's fun as long as it doesn't take on actual harmful real world consequences. Then
yeah, sure.
everybody can do with it what they want, realistically. We're
I
getting on to
agree. I
residential
agree.
school there. So, oh, that was it. Yes, your book. Can we discuss your
Oh,
book for a moment? Can you tell us about that?
so I've been trying to do things that are actually about engagement, but also books that go places no one's gone before. Because you know what? There are hundreds of books you can buy on early medieval archaeology more broadly, or the Vikings in particular, but there's never been a dedicated book, an edited book, where specialists come together and talk about the challenges of communicating, what we've just been talking about,
Right.
the politics, the extremists, but also the genuine passion and so I did a student conference. We did it as a student conference, so the students had to present and do their own research, and then we got some experts in to be guest speakers, and I produced. Then I thought, hey, why don't we? This is one of a series of books I've done like this, where you have the student conference where the students participate, and those that want to can write up their work and get it published, so the students can get published. So, and then I invite experts in to contribute. And the theme we did was called Digging into the Dark Ages, Early Medieval Public Archaeologies. And while that's a bit of a long title, the point is, that's probably back to front on your screen, but it's about the Dark Ages is one of those dodgy terms, but I thought
Right.
digging into it, pulling it apart, what do people think about it? What are that would be the title, to explore how heritage sites, museums, archaeology engages people, but we've got to deal with some really dodgy ideas. So it's download for free. You can download it for free. You can buy it from Archaeopress's website if you want to have a physical copy, but the free download of the whole book. And we've got chapters that look at, why do horned helmets still matter? That's one of my students'
Hang
essays.
on.
He's actually talking about
Where can that be downloaded again? Because I'm going to
it's
get
the
Eric to type it out.
it's Archaeopress, one word. So it's Archeo ARCHAEO Press, and Archaeopress are one of the big UK archaeology publishers. And if you go to their website or just Google Archaeopress digging into the Dark Ages, you'll be able to. They've got their website has a download link, so you can just drop down the whole book as a PDF. So and so you've got that. That's really good. And it's got lots of different chapters in it about the challenges. So it's the first ever review in 40 years of the Jorvik heritage site, and the interpretations manager there does a history of Jorvik in York, in the historic city of York, and how they've changed the display, and there's other papers on museums, there's papers on heritage sites, there's papers on controversies that have surrounded some early medieval archaeological sites and debates. And there's papers dealing with, as I was just using the example of horned helmets, one of my students wrote about, how horned helmets have powerful connotations used by football clubs, used by everything. And yet,
People
actually,
storming the
there are,
Capitol.
yeah. And you have this it's a way in, even though it's dodgy and it's no real evidence for it. It's a way in for people to engage. And so we have a whole series of papers, and we also have someone that might be familiar to some of the listeners, a certain Dr. Jackson Crawford, who has his own YouTube channel. I did an interview with him, and he does a whole Old Norse YouTube channel. And I did an interview with him talking about why he did it and how it's going. I've got an interview in the book with Dr. Kat Jarman, who people might know her name from writing a brand new best-selling book called The River Kings. So I have an interview with her because she's done TV. She's done TV media stuff. I appeared with her on a TV program, a documentary about the Vikings at Repton called Britain's Viking Graveyard. So my point is it's a good collection because it tries to bring together people who are trying to engage and reflecting on the problems as well. So it's about how do we communicate our stories, and also what are the challenges with that. And it doesn't cover everything, but you know what? The thing I'm proud about is it's a bit of a mishmash book, but it's the first of its kind. And no one before, of all the books on the Vikings, no one's done a book about the challenges of public communication, of SciComm, if you like, or,
We do have comments in here saying like that's a wonderful thing for students. It's a really good
yeah,
opportunity. There needs to be made more accessible outside of academia. And you're quite right, because otherwise you get either academic textbooks or you get questionable nonsense sometimes.
yeah.
So it's
And
nice
so
to
this is
around.
obviously this is an academic style book. It's not a popular, easy read, but and some of the contributors are, new to the whole thing. They're not experienced, so some of the chapters are quite short. And I've had a few academics go, "Oh, this kind of product's not up to standard." But I think it's actually a higher standard in some ways than other things I've seen, and it does some things different. So I'm very proud of this book. It came out in the early part of 2020, so it's still brand new, and it's got an afterword by Professor Bonnie Efros, she's going to Canada, actually. She's going to University of British Columbia, I think.
Oh, that's where I
She's been,
go.
yeah. So she was at Liverpool. She's at Liverpool, history at Liverpool. And now she's just moving to University of British Columbia, I think, uh, this, well, next year. And Bonnie is one of the leading experts in the history of archaeology and the Merovingian, the Franks. She doesn't do the
Ah,
Vikings so much, but she's written the afterword called Whose Dark Ages? What are we doing this for? Who are the people that we're talking about and why? And so she's a great expert scholar. So you've got some of the big names in the book as well as sort of new voices, and I think that's and of course it's coming from a UK perspective because that's where the conference was, and you could do a book like this all about North America, really, or
yeah.
all about continental Europe or Scandinavia, and that's why I'm contributing this afterward to this new book on Viking heritage as well. But I'm quite proud of this for getting it out there, and
You should be.
um, oh, thank you. But it's doing things that have not been done before, anyway.
So we just have Chris here from Denmark signed in to say hi. Hi, Chris. Also, you missed some talk of the Danes. I'm sorry you were late. I'm sure you were sleeping or doing something more interesting than listening to us ramble on, but it's good to see you here now. So we did have people bring up Ireland in this discussion, and Dublin specifically. So a lot of people, I'm not sure if you know, and this becomes a problematic discussion when we're talking North America. There'll always be the racists, generally speaking, the Irish Americans who say, well, the Irish were slaves too.
Yeah.
We're not going to get into that. And then somebody else will find the information saying that Dublin was the largest slave market in the world at one time, and then usually inaccurately blame the Irish people for that. But the reason that Dublin was the largest slave market in the world at that time is because Dublin wasn't Irish at that time. So now we have a gentleman in here that can maybe discuss the history of Dublin itself, because a lot of North Americans specifically don't know what Dublin means. It's not an Irish word. They don't know who founded it or really anything about it. And I feel like that's one of those things that can be used even inadvertently, to perpetuate some dangerous stereotypes. So off you go, Professor, on that one.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I suppose this like colonization, the whole reason I waded in on the Lance thing is because using the word colonization to say, yeah, there were Viking colonization can lead some people into thinking, well, that's all right. If people were doing it back in the Viking Age, then why do we care about the last few hundred years as if they're somehow comparable, and that the former justifies or reifies, legitimizes the latter, and the same with slavery, right? So there's no comparable scale character of slavery to the transatlantic slave trade, and yet, of course, the Vikings were amongst many groups in early medieval Europe who were slave traders on a massive scale. And there's a number of different sub dangers here. A lot of people say, yeah, it was all the Arabs demanding slaves. That's what fueled the Viking slave trade. Well, that was a part of it. But, again, you can see how easily that can be utilized in a very dodgy way.
Xenophobic sort of way. Yeah.
Yeah. And also seeing the Irish as both victims and participants in slave trade can be used to create white victimhood. Oh, well, if the Irish were all slaves in the 9th century, then, that's just as bad. So you end up, that's the problem with all these topics, is that, we're trying to explain that history is a complex problem, but just because we use the same word, enslaved people, or as opposed to slaves, or whatever, precise term you prefer, you doesn't mean that suddenly you're off the hook in terms of discussing the legacies of European colonization, and I think that's why people latch onto the Vikings, because if you use terms like colonization and slavery in the Viking world, you have to use them because they happened, they were things.
Yeah.
But it's an easy out for people who want to cushion the scale and the trauma and the immediate legacy of recent centuries by saying, well, everyone's committed genocide, everyone's always colonizers colonize, everyone's warlike. Yes, of course they are. No one's ever said that the world was a peaceful place before Europeans started colonizing. No one's ever said that. That's just one of those classic whatever, straw men things, isn't it? But people just want the Vikings to fill that role. Well, they had slavery too, so what of it? No, they didn't have massive sugar plantations. Slavery in the ancient world, slavery. I mean, even in the ancient world, slavery was very different than, say, Roman Britain from, say, Roman Greece or Roman southern Italy. The scale and character of slavery. Likewise, in the Viking world, Dublin would have been a slave market, and a big one. But so would have other sites across the Russian river systems, the Scandinavia itself, and around continental Western Europe. Dorstadt, Quentivik, London, Ipswich, York, these would all have been slave markets. The problem is, as archaeologists, we can't see those slaves. Slavery is invisible. And that's true even at that's why people are happy.
It now. Yeah. Like what people like to forget, when we're discussing it now, we're discussing it in the context of, for example, North America. For example, the concept of race in general, of white people and brown people, which was invented in Europe for white supremacy reasons. Like when we're talking about, we're not talking about Asia 2,000 years ago. We're talking about, African Americans today and indigenous genocide, the active colonization of Ireland. We're talking about not ancient history. We're talking about real people living today that are still experiencing these systems. And I feel like the second people kind of remove that, go all everybody up. These are people that are alive right now having a discussion about this, and you're speaking over them and diminishing their experience and their struggle.
I suppose from my perspective, everything I do with the early Middle Ages, everything I write and try to do, I try to be conscious of these things. I'm not saying I'm perfect. I'm not saying I get everything right, but when I'm talking with a class, I saw Arceus Spook earlier said that she's had derogatory comments said about her community from lecturers, calling them those people, I cannot say in my career of 23 years I haven't occasionally talked about particular community groups as, oh, those people, roll of the eyes, like metal detectorists who have there's a big issue with illegal metal detecting. I won't pretend I've never said, not upon ethnic groups I'm talking about, but in terms of local communities, oh God, it's so difficult working with these people. I've done that myself in frustration, and I'm not pure of soul, and occasionally I've got things wrong, but I think all we can do is make people aware that 1,000 years ago was yesterday for some people, and that
Or
the
today for some
Vikings,
people.
yeah, and tomorrow, because it's about how we craft our futures and our sense of who we are. And
Exactly.
I feel that we've got to we can't pretend we're just in a little chamber. I've got to say this, it was really interesting. I did a little advert video for this, a little advert video earlier today about, I was going
I
to go
saw
on and
that.
talk about Viking, and a comment was put on and then deleted by an academic who identified themselves as an academic and said, and I can't quote them because I can't remember exactly what they said, and I didn't screen capture it, but they deleted it. I didn't delete it. They deleted it. I'm not sure why, but they said, I am a scholar of Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse. I have a PhD in it. I won't deal with these Vikings being popular conceptions, everything from Marvel to Norse pagan communities, I presume he means. And then he said, I can't wait for it to be unpopular again. Like, or something like, I can't wait for it to go away, that people stop being interested in this. And I
That's an
think that,
awesome way to put it.
if I was talking to you in the 1950s or 60s, oh no, Kirk Douglas is a Viking film. How terrible, Gerald. What are we going to do? Well, I'm going to write another 3-volume treatise about Old Norse sagas, and I should scoff at it when the newspaper man comes. Yeah, all right, but come on, we're in the 2020s. If our attitude as academics is, I can't wait for people to stop being interested in the very period that we're studying.
That we're
What a
interested in. Yeah.
woeful yeah, so he deleted that because I didn't. I just said, "Oh dear, that's very sad." I think it's really an important to be part of these conversations, but that attitude is out there. I know scholars who've admitted to me they've never watched The Last Kingdom, they've never watched Vikings, they refuse to watch it because they are scholars of the period and they know it's wrong. And I would say that a lot of those TV shows, of course they're wrong, of course they're rubbish and in many ways, but actually there's some
Right?
really, really interesting portrayals of women. Yes, they have a warrior women, but most women aren't warrior women in that show. They have slaves. They have lots of different roles of children. Of course it's biased. Of course it's a caricature. Of course it's really trying to show a version of the sagas rather than the actual Viking Age. It's almost like a modern TV show showing you what 13th century people thought that the 9th century might have been like. Of
Right.
course, in the same way that the film 300, no one goes to see the film 300 and thinks, oh, that's why Lena Headey was really like that. That's how, come on, it's a film. But if you just ignore it, how on earth are we going to communicate at any level
Yeah.
if people, as academics? So
Well, and
that's
the
another of
issue
my
is,
rants.
especially in North America, I have a few videos because most of my history study has been in World War One and Two. I've done quite a lot of that. Um, and one of my first videos where I waded into history talk because I was trying to avoid it. It is very toxic. Was discussing Vimy Ridge and the Battle of in World War One, Canadian soldiers, blah blah blah. My question that I posed to people was: has American Hollywood movies and films skewed people's perception of history so drastically that this is what they believe to be true? And what showed up in thousands of comments was yes, that is the fact. So if you don't have academics weighing in going, that is a beautiful story, it's a really great story they did there, but I would just like to remind you that it is in fact a story, and if you would like the real information, here's the source. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not going, you're
Yeah.
wrong for liking that, or that's stupid. It's just, it's a good story. Here's the truth though, if you're interested, and if you're not, enjoy your story. Just don't treat it as history.
Very true. Very true. I love that video, by the way. It was great.
Well, I just did one on New Zealand as well because I felt so bad for them.
Yeah, I
In the
like that one
comments,
too. That's
people were giving all the suggestions of what to do next, and I had a bunch, and a bunch of them were quite good. But immediately I was like, New Zealand first, and the reason is they are so notoriously overlooked. It's comical, and they're so laid back.
yeah,
They're horizontal, so they're not going to stand up and be like, "We did this." They won't. They'll just be like,
yeah.
"Ah, never mind." So I figured they should get a little bit of a light shine for once. So because we are coming to the end of we got 15 more minutes. So
Okay.
before I open the floor for everybody else to ask you questions, because we're very lucky that you've come in to speak to us. I want to thank you very much for that. I want to ask you, what is one thing that you think isn't discussed enough about the Viking era? Like, we talk about all of these myths and these legends and these What is one really good thing about the Viking era and Viking society that we benefit from that maybe people don't know about or talk about quite enough?
Whoa. Oh, I should
That
have
was
seen that one coming, and I should have an answer. You'd think I would, wouldn't you? Ah, you got me there. One thing that we don't talk about that would benefit us, because that's what your word is, something that would be interesting. Um, well, I mean, perhaps this is too, perhaps that people already know this, but I think it's got to be hammered home because I think people are still catching up. So I will say it is just how diverse in terms of contacts and communities Viking Age Scandinavia and the Viking world was, which is why I actually used the word. People have had a go at me for doing it in the video comments, why I use Viking rather than Norse. And there's a whole debate there. But I would say, because if you think about these trading towns like Birka and Hedeby, or Heidebu, um, these trading communities would have had resident populations and traders. They would have had slaves, but they would have had people from Slavic speakers. They would have had Germanic continental speakers, Franks, Saxons. They would have had Anglo-Saxons, Irish. They would have had Scottish Gaelic speakers. They would have had, in terms linguistic terms and cultural terms, they would have had Finns. They would have had Sami. They would have been either there as traders, as slaves, as retinues of soldiers, as seafarers. These communities, I mean, these are the trading sites. I'm not saying that the whole of Scandinavia was like some kind of Hollywood representation score check sheet of how many people of different ages and genders and ethnicities they had. I'm not saying that, right? But I am saying that there was never a time in the first millennium AD where Scandinavia was all white and all Norse. In
which
fact, most of
globally at the time, I
yeah,
personally feel is a standout. That is one where, like, when they're constantly talking about how Viking women, no, because that's not
yeah.
accurate. But
So
the
you would have had
inclusivity of
this, yeah,
Viking culture, that is something that isn't discussed enough. Because, and I think that's how it falls under the Aryan fallacy all the time, where it's like, that is just
yeah.
so very inaccurate. Another point on that I want to bring up and ask you about, the myth of Viking tattoos. So there's been a lot of discussion about whether
Okay.
Norse society actually had tattoos, or whether or not the tattoos that we see in grave sites were of Norse origin, or they were simply
Okay. Okay, tattoos a bit. Oh God, I'm gonna get into trouble with this one, right? So we do have a couple of sources do talk about. There's one Arab source. The name escapes me. Does talk about men and women wearing cosmetics in Hedeby in the 10th century. So a
right.
lot of the Vikings TV show Guyliner and stuff like that is not ridiculous. It's within the parameters of what may have happened, right? In terms of exaggerating facial features, all of that stuff is open. Absolutely, I have no problem with any of that. People roll their eyes and it's all rubbish. Tattoos, though, I'm not. I've read about this and I can't remember the exact facts. So this is only just an off the cuff thing, but I think we have this art on woodwork, we have this art on metalwork, we have art on stone sculpture. People's skin was surely a medium for art, for body art, whether it's painted or tattooed. So that's my default assumption, is that why wouldn't they have had some kind of tattooing? What I don't know for sure is if we have any conclusive evidence for the kind of stuff you see in the TV show Vikings, of this blue sort of stuff all over your face. I mean, I seriously doubt that. Face paint, guy liner, for war, for cult, for just looking cool, for looking
See, so
weird, for being a
my
Floki.
argument,
Hand gestures, you got to do the weird Floki hand gestures.
yeah,
All fine, but I don't know about actual body and facial tattoos. That's more. I mean, it's a modern aesthetic inspired by a range of places, so we can't pretend it was exactly like that. I just think that we have to assume that tattooing was common. And do you know, in the 19th century, the common idea was all barbarian peoples were tattooed like Picts, blue painted, and even the Anglo-Saxons were seen as. So if you read Charles Kingsley's incredibly racist Hereward the Wake, he talks about Hereward's tattoos, because Victorians thought tats were a barbarian thing. So my point is, it's not impossible, but we've got to aware that comes with baggage too. That you can't. Nothing that we do with the Viking Age can we sit back comfortably and say, "Oh, that's free of racist associations."
I
Everything
think
has
that's
got
what it is.
some.
I think it is racist associations, because I think we would we would have had tattooing, and we would have had that sort of thing in Viking burials, perhaps.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
The argument that all Viking burials, because we see bones, you know what I mean? You see bones now. The argument that
we don't
all
have
of those people were of Norse descent or
Yeah,
were
yeah.
born in Scandinavia is where the problem
Skin
comes. So
tone.
everything is attributed to Norse culture, but you have to understand, and most people don't. This was a very inclusive group, and especially when you're talking Vikings, like the actual job of Viking. Was a very inclusive group of people. You cannot guarantee that a body in a mound was born in Scandinavia or was white
Yeah, I mean,
or blonde or any of that.
And it's not just TV films, also artist reconstructions, heritage sites, when we show all people with light coloured skin in these reconstructions. And if you dare to put a dark coloured skin person in an artist reconstruction, it's political correctness gone mad. Political correctness gone mad. How dare you? How dare you? You're just pandering. It's just like the same with films and stuff, and you have the same outrage. But actually, we do have evidence for people coming from as far away as North Africa, as far away as the West Asia, perhaps
Lost
even from
Ages.
India, in Northern Europe. It's not that there would have been thousands upon thousands of people with dark skins, but if you can't even accept the possibility and you can't engage with that conversation, I think that does reveal a problem. And
well,
I think
and the fact that at that time historically, yes, like you say, most were slaves. Let's be honest.
yeah.
But the fact that they were not all slaves, and some non-Norse men or women, I'll say men mostly, had predominant positions in society, being of not white descent. That is not something that we would have seen really anywhere else, except for in the odd, rare, crazy rare case. But for the most part, the fact that even where landowners or merchants or anything else, or shipbuilders or what be it, the fact that they were not only slaves, not only were they were not only slaves in Norse society.
Okay, can I give you a quick example that brings that to light? Now, I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but the two female osteologically sexed females that are in the richest early Viking Age burial, the most famous one. Every book on the Vikings you'll open up, Osebeya, the ship burial. One of those two individuals, their stable isotopes indicate they grew up in the Black Sea area. Doesn't mean they're black or brown or our modern characterizations of skin tone, but they certainly weren't blonde-haired, blue-eyed Northern European, whatever that may. And of course, most Vikings weren't blonde-haired, blue-eyed Northern European anyway. That's another stereotype. But my point is, one of those two individuals in that rich burial. Now, everyone goes, "Oh no, but she must have been the slave." Why? We've got lots of evidence of high status. Yeah. So we've got lots of evidence of high status gear in these rich burials coming from all over the world. Some of those people must have come into Scandinavia and acquired high status positions, I think. If we can't even entertain that possibility, if we have to see everybody who's foreign as a slave, I think that is quite revealing.
Follow Archaeodeath on WordPress, or you'll never learn.